All right, for more on all of this, let's bring in Jonathan Conricus, former spokesperson for the IDF and senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, always good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. So I want to talk about the Strait of Hormuz because Israel gets the bulk of its oil shipments from Azerbaijan and it generates a lot of its electricity from natural gas. But obviously, gas prices are higher in Israel. I mean, it affects everybody across the entire world because 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. And so what's interesting, I think, is that the calculation, though, among Israelis is different. Their focus, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, is national security. National security and the imminent threat that has been posed by Iran for many, many decades is so important that the economic pain is almost, as I understand it, a minor price to pay. When you think about the Americans, though, the calculation is very different because here in the US, gas prices are such an important political issue that the US is under so much pressure to find a way out of this war. So my question to you is, if the war in Iran ends in 2 to 3 weeks, as the president is touting, without any kind of regime change, knowing that the Iranians, without regime change, are simply going to work very, very hard after this war ends to build up their weaponry and their arsenal, will this entire exercise, Jonathan, have been a waste?
Yes, well, hello, and thanks for having me back on. No, I think there are tremendous achievements already, and I think that before Israel and the US are done, there will be even more important military achievements. Officials from both countries have spoken about it at length. I won't, repeat all the details, but taking their nuclear capabilities off the table, their ballistic missile production capability, their ability to fire, mostly, not yet all of it, but a lot of that has been degraded, and there's still more to come. But I think looking forward, this will be a weakened and wounded Iranian regime, vulnerable to domestic and external pressure. But I think if the US and the world leaves the Hormuz Strait like it is now in the hands of this regime that will probably, enforce some kind of protection racket, whereby countries like the French have obviously done will be paying or conceding otherwise diplomatically in order to get goods across the strait. That's a very bad recipe for the future, and that would send a very, I think, bad message to other rogue nations around the world that they could do the same things that the Iranian regime is doing and get away with it. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that at the end of the day, the US will probably be in the leading position. Hopefully, European, Arab, and maybe even Asian countries will say, okay, it is in our interest to make sure that nobody has the power to close an important international waterway, and therefore we will pry it open. We will pry it open using military tools, which is possible, not something that is impossible to do, and I think that's where things are going as of now.
Yeah, I think that we have conflicting reports about how many of these vessels have actually paid and whether they've paid in Chinese yuan, which is a whole other conversation to be had about some of the consequences of this war.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask you about what's happening with regards to the north there and the fighting against Hezbollah, because Israel has directed the majority of its forces there and resources to Iran, and yet we see Hezbollah continue to volley about 200 or so projectiles a day into Israel. We hear these threats from the defense minister, and yes, there are humanitarian concerns. You hear all of the pushback from international bodies, Jonathan, but there's internal pushback and concern among Israeli military and former officials as well, that some are calling this push to the Litani River, I'm going to quote, a march of folly. Is Israel actually going to be able to secure the north here, or is this going to be another unsinkable war with Lebanon, where you are going to see not only a humanitarian crisis, but a loss of a number of Israeli soldiers as well?
Well, what I think we're seeing is classic Israeli strategic miscommunication. Minister Katz isn't the person who should be communicating this. This should be communicated by, first and foremost, the prime minister, and it should be something that is first and foremost dealt with diplomatically and coordinated with the US, with France, and with other parties, and then declared by whatever official. And it's the other way around here, and that's unfortunate. I think what Minister Katz should have said from the beginning is, listen, the dear state of Lebanon, our border to the north, we have no essential issue with you. Our issue is with the fact that you are not sovereign and you've been allowing Hezbollah time and time again to use your country as a launch pad against our civilians. And you got away with it once, twice, three times. Now, Israel is changing the rules of the game. And we're saying that you are no longer going to be allowed to facilitate attacks from Lebanese soil against Israeli civilians without paying a price. What's the price? No longer only destruction of Hezbollah infrastructure and the other parts that support it, but Israel is going to take, at least temporarily, terrain and hold on to it, because we know that that is really eventually what hurts. Now, I would distinguish between two very important parts of this big chunk of land, which is south of the Litani. There are the Shiite villages that are in immediate proximity to the Israeli-Lebanese border, or the Blue Line. There, I think not much will be left the day after the war, because all of these villages, some 20 or so villages, all of the Shiite ones, there are 3 Christian ones, they're out of the game, but the Shiite ones, they have been used systematically by Hezbollah to conduct attacks against Israel. And the understanding in Israel is, as long as those villages exist, they will be used by Hezbollah in the future. So the quick conclusion is, let's not have that infrastructure there so that they won't be able to be used by Hezbollah. The other parts of southern Lebanon, south of the Litani, totally different ballgame, and I seriously doubt that Israel really thinks about, taking sovereign land of another country. I don't think it would be very useful. I think that what Israel probably will end up doing is clearing a perimeter immediately north of the border. That will enhance security for Israeli civilians. And then the other part will be to apply pressure on the Lebanese government to do what they have said that they're going to do, to disarm Hezbollah and to become a sovereign country in control of their territory.
Jonathan, just going back to the war in Iran, in chess, just like in war, you always have to think 2 or 3 steps ahead. You constantly have to think about what your opponent is going to do next. And one of the biggest criticisms that the Americans and the Israelis got at the start of this war was that they saw taking out the Ayatollah as a moment of opportunity, because you had all these sort of senior Iranian officials gathered in the same room. But there was not much thought about what would happen the next day. And that is why the US is in this bind right now, especially with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. At this particular point in time, now that we are in this war, bearing in mind there's an important lesson being learned here about the importance of thinking 10 steps ahead, how much are the Israelis really thinking about how they want to engage with a post-war Iran, especially if this regime is still in place?
Yeah, I would seriously doubt the veracity of that, because I think what I've seen in US and Israeli planning, what I've spoken with Israeli officials and heard American generals speak about, that isn't the case. There was a lot of planning here. There was a lot of foresight, and there's a whole strategic buildup. And what we're seeing is a systematic takeover, systematic grinding of Iranian military capabilities. Slowly but surely, their ability to project force, their ability to continue with their strategy of using proxies, of firing missiles, of threatening the use of or having a nuclear umbrella in order to be the regional bully, all of that is being dismantled, and it's a matter of time. Wars are not won, instantly. I know that in this day and age, we all expect things to happen fast and without casualties and to be instant. That isn't how wars are won. The enemy is fighting back. But at the end of the day, what I'm seeing in military terms is a gradually developing plan, military plan, where the only X factor, and albeit a very important one, is how does the Iranian regime get toppled? And that, I agree, there's a lot of gray in that topic. I think currently what Israel is busy doing, and some of it together with the US, is weakening the regime, softening its grip on the population to such an extent that it will become easier and possible for the Iranian people to reclaim their freedom. I agree. That isn't easy. It's not something that you can chart on a map and you have certainty how it's going to develop. And we don't know exactly how the Iranian people will be able to rally. We don't know how cruel and violent the Iranian regime will be in response. But I think what Israel is doing is really facilitating for that to happen. And it's going to be tremendously interesting to revisit this conversation, a few months ahead of now, after this. And I think what we'll be able to establish then will be that there was indeed a plan. There was indeed a lot of thinking, and that it will work. And I think that the days of this Iranian regime actually are numbered. I know that this is a minority opinion in international media today. I believe that that is the case, and I think that in a few more months, the Iranian people will be free, and we will be in a new Middle East.
Well, we'll see, because the president keeps on saying 2 more weeks. Every 2 weeks, he says 2 more weeks, 2 more weeks. We'll see how this ends.
He also says who knew that the Iranians would be attacking their GCC neighbors when, two things can be right at the same time. Military planners could have foreseen that. But when the president of the United States says that he was surprised, that leads to Zane's question about what was the actual planning here. Jonathan Conricus, good to see you as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.